If you remember when we discussed the Bhagavad Gita, we really highlighted that third path in the paths to liberation that were discussed in that text. Remember, that third path is Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion. And we said that it would really transform the way Hinduism would continue to develop to this very day, where many, many Hindus today would understand their spiritual journey within the framework primarily of Bhakti Yoga. And remember, the idea there is that even if you can't follow the first couple of paths perfectly, by living a perfectly selfless life, or by achieving this higher wisdom of the Upanishads, which is very philosophical and abstract in nature, you can still make progress and maybe even achieve moksha if you follow this path of devotion, where you devote yourself in love and worship to a personal deity that you view as the supreme personal form of Brahman. Brahman, supreme being, but now becoming manifest in all of the deities, but for you in one chosen deity, who you view as more significant than all the others, worthy of this extra worship, because that deity is able to give you grace to assist you on your journey. Now, we think that the Bhagavad Gita might have been composed sometime around the turn of the Common Era, but you can see here on the screen that what we will call this wave of bhakti, this wide circulation of this Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion, really isn't going to get started until around the 6th century of the Common Era. So it takes a few centuries for this new idea to really start to be taught on a larger level. Remember, it's hard for ideas to spread in an age before a printing press, before a lot of literacy, before TV, radio, internet, etc. It takes time because it has to go by word of mouth. Plus, you had a situation where some of the higher caste individuals wanted to maintain a certain level of control over the religious ideas that were being taught. So it's only around the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries that we start to see a wider circulation of this notion of Bhakti Yoga. And it's primarily due to a couple of different groups of individuals who are traveling around village to village in southern India, singing songs of devotion or bhakti to their chosen supreme personal forms of Brahman. One group is focused on devotion to Shiva. We're going to focus on the other group. And this group is made up of individuals who are devoting themselves in love and worship to Vishnu as their supreme personal form of Brahman. This group is known as the Alvars. And the Alvars, there are 12 of them. They are not all living at the same time, but over a couple of 100-year span. And they are, again, basically traveling singer-songwriters who are trying to spread this new idea of devoting yourself in love and worship to a supreme personal form of Brahman in order to reach moksha, or at least make significant spiritual progress. And the notion of bhakti already seems to inherently open up the tradition for more people, for all people, because the idea here is that you don't have to be a philosophical genius in order to make spiritual progress on this path, like you might need to be if you're going to try to access the difficulties of the Upanishads, which are very abstract philosophical teachings. You don't have to be someone who can devote hours and hours and hours of your daily lives to some form of meditation or some effort of trying to grasp complex religious ideas. All you need to do is worship your chosen deity and receive that grace. So the idea of bhakti already seems to encourage what I'm calling here a kind of openness to all. It tears down some of those boundaries in terms of who can make spiritual progress. But there are a couple of other unique things about the Alvars that also encourages a wider circulation of real spiritual progress among the followers of what we call Hinduism. So first, the Alvars, when they're singing these songs of praise from village to village beginning in southern India, they are singing these songs in the vernacular. That's just an English word that means in the local language. The local language in many of these villages was Tamil. It was not Sanskrit. Now we know that the Vedas were composed in Sanskrit. So according to the tradition, especially according to the Dharma Shastras, like the laws of Manu, religious teaching could only be done in the sacred language of Sanskrit. The problem was that most people, the average people, especially in southern India, didn't know Sanskrit. They didn't speak Sanskrit. What they spoke was Tamil. And now you have these Alvars coming to these villages, and they are breaking the rules set forth in the laws of Manu and promoting this understanding of the spiritual life in the vernacular, the language actually spoken by the people. And this again helps to open the tradition up to all people, not just those trained in the sacred language of Sanskrit. Another really interesting thing is the makeup of the Alvars. One of the 12 Alvars was a woman. Now remember, the laws of Manu contain some gender discrimination toward women and really reduce women oftentimes to domestic dharmas. Here you have a woman who is now composing and teaching these songs of praise to Vishnu that are still sung to this day by followers of Vishnu. Right? Again, at that time, the laws of Manu would have said that women can't really even learn about the religious life, let alone teach others and encourage others along that path. And here you have a direct challenge to the authority of the laws of Manu by having a female Alvar. You also had an Alvar of the lower castes, maybe a servant or maybe even an outcast. And once again, remember some of that caste discrimination from the laws of Manu. This is a direct challenge. Lower caste individuals, those in the servant caste or outcasts, were not even allowed to become students and learn about the spiritual journey, let alone teach others, and yet that's exactly what you have happening here. So those are two examples, the vernacular and then having the woman and the servant or outcast Alvar, that really show the challenge being brought against the laws of Manu and the opening up of the tradition through this wave of bhakti that starts to spread in southern India. Now, as the wave continues in North India, once we get into the second millennium of the Common Era, I just want to highlight one interesting figure, and his name is Kabir. Kabir is an interesting figure, especially because he is often claimed by two different religious traditions to be a member of their tradition. And this has to do then with the tension that existed in northern India in the second millennium between Hinduism and Islam. Muslim conquerors had already made their way to North India, so you had a strong population of Muslims, a strong population of Hindus, and there was a lot of tension between these two groups. Kabir, interestingly, tried to ease that tension, and at least from the Hindu side, he did so by really focusing on bhakti. The idea was that, look, despite all of the differences between Hinduism and Islam, Hindus are ultimately, in Kabir's mind, simply trying to worship God or the goddess in the way that they view this supreme personal form of Brahman. In other words, just trying to worship the deity, the divine, however that deity is understood. And what Kabir was saying is that's what Muslims are doing as well. So the two groups might have different interpretations of the divine, but ultimately if they are trying to make progress by worshiping the divine in order to receive grace and mercy, then there's a lot more common ground between the two traditions than what separates them. So it's an interesting situation where bhakti was now used to try to show the commonalities, to move beyond the particularities that was causing so much religious tension between Hindus and Muslims in North India. Unfortunately, that tension would continue and even continues to this day, but Kabir tried to use the spread of bhakti in a way to ease that tension. The last figure I want to mention here is Caitanya, who is another bhakti thinker. We're moving into the 15th and 16th centuries with Caitanya. And Caitanya was interesting because he didn't really think of bhakti as just one possible path to moksha. Caitanya said that because of the age in which we find ourselves, we must rely on bhakti yoga. We must rely on the grace that can be given from our supreme personal form of Brahman, which for Caitanya was Krishna. And this has to do with some earlier texts that talk about the cycles of time. We've already seen these big cycles of creation and destruction, but there are smaller cycles within the larger cycles. And one small cycle has 4 stages, and it has to do with the strength of dharma. So it is said that in the first stage, in the smallest cycle of 4 stages, dharma is strong. It is said that it is steady and firm like a bull standing on 4 legs. Right? And it's said that this first stage will last around a couple of million earthly years, right? I forget the precise numbers that are found in some of these early teachings. And then we make our way to the second stage, and this is when Dharma is said to be standing on 3 legs. Just a little bit shaky, but still pretty firm. What that means is that people generally know the right thing to do. They know their relationship-specific moral obligations, and they generally have the will to actually fulfill those obligations. In the third stage, Dharma is on 2 legs. A little wobbly now, a little bit unsteady. And then in the final stage, and this is called the Kali Yuga, Kali Yuga. The yugas are these various stages. This is the Kali Yuga, the 4th stage. By this point, we're down to a stage that will last around 432,000 earthly years. And it is said at that stage, Dharma is hopping on 1 leg, which means Dharma is very weak in the world, which means people don't really know the right thing to do. And even if they do, they have a hard time actually doing the right thing. And according to some of these different teachings, we entered into this 4th stage, this Kali Yuga, only around maybe 5,000 years ago, which means we still have 400 and something thousand years left when Dharma will continually decline in terms of our world that we are experiencing now. So for Caitanya, he says, look, because of the age in which we live, we cannot rely on our own effort to experience moksha, because we are too weak. Dharma is weak, and therefore our nature is weak, and therefore the only way to make spiritual progress and experience moksha is by relying on the grace that can be given to us from, in his case, Krishna. So it's a little bit of a stronger push toward bhakti yoga than what you might have seen among earlier thinkers who said, well, theoretically, maybe it's possible to experience moksha along other paths, but this might just be the easiest path, the path that is available to the most people. Caitanya is saying, no, this is really now the only path. Doesn't mean we shouldn't still try to be selfless and try to attain wisdom, but this is the path that we must follow given the weakness of Dharma in our age. Okay? Now, Caitanya's influence ebbs and flows over the next few centuries, but there is one really interesting group that claims to be in the lineage of Caitanya's teaching. And this is a group called ISKCON, or the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. You may have heard of this group as the Hare Krishna movement, and you can certainly use that phrase to refer to this group because that just gets to their primary song of praise to Krishna. And the Hare Krishna movement, especially for those of us in America, is really interesting because it's probably the first Hindu group or movement that actually begins in the United States. It's a group that begins in New York City in the 1960s, and it really doesn't trace itself back to a specific institutional group in India, although it does trace its teachings back to the influence of Caitanya, because the Hare Krishna movement will be all about the grace that can be received from Krishna through bhakti yoga. The Hare Krishna movement gained some popularity in the 60s and 70s. You would often find a Hare Krishna presence on college or university campuses. The idea, especially in the 60s and 70s, is that this is when a lot of young people were interested in new ideas and maybe were interested in turning their back on some of their family's ideas in terms of their own heritage. So the Hare Krishna movement set up shop on a lot of university campuses, and there's still a Hare Krishna presence on a lot of college and university campuses to this day. You would also find Hare Krishna members often in airport terminals. This had to be before September 11th. This was back when anybody could go into the terminals. And the Hare Krishna movement realized that people in the terminals were often on layovers, and this is before you had iPods or iPads or anything else. So you could often engage in conversations because people didn't have much else to do. And you would often see them in airport terminals handing out pamphlets or even translations of the Bhagavad Gita, or they would be singing and dancing. It's a very, very fascinating group. I remember going downtown Chicago as an undergraduate student, oftentimes on Sunday nights to the Hare Krishna temple for their services. And it's such a fun experience because the group is generally so excited to be singing and dancing and playing music in praise to Krishna. And they'd be very welcoming of anyone else who would want to be there just to experience the joy of singing these praises to Krishna. And there would usually be a meal then following for everybody to continue the conversations. It's also a really interesting group, again, because of this desire to seek converts, which we've said is typically not normal within Hinduism. We don't think of Hinduism as one of the world's great missionary religions, but the Hare Krishna movement has been more active in trying to spread its teachings. And for that reason, you're more likely to find more people that don't have an Indian heritage in a Hare Krishna temple than in many other Hindu temples, because Hare Krishna individuals have been trying to bring others in, and therefore they'll bring African Americans, white Americans, others into the community, whereas most Hindu communities still have that direct tie to an Indian heritage or an Indian ethnicity. So very interesting group. This kind of just shows us what's been happening over the last 1,500 years in terms of this spread of bhakti, which again really is the framework within which most Hindus today will think about their spiritual life. They will think in terms of their devotion to their supreme personal form of Brahman as a way to make spiritual progress and hopefully have a chance at attaining moksha.